We spend our lives navigating uncertainty. We look at probabilities, a 70% chance of rain, you grab an umbrella,
Sure.
a 7% chance the market goes down, maybe you sell some stock.
Right, you play the odds.
But what happens when the stakes are, well, infinitely higher? When it's not about getting wet or losing money, but about a person's life, their freedom. That's a whole different ballgame.
It is. Because in that space, in the courtroom, probability just isn't good enough. You can't be 70% sure. The system demands something much, much closer to absolute certainty.
An engineered confidence.
That's a great way to put it. It's an engineered structural confidence. When the state, with all its power, decides it wants to take away someone's liberty, it has to first agree to restrain itself, to tie one hand behind its own back, so to speak.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we're going to peel back the layers on how all these different legal systems separated by huge gaps in time, geography, culture, somehow, almost magically, arrived at the exact same conclusion.
That the presumption of innocence is non-negotiable.
Exactly. That it's the ultimate safeguard against doubt.
And it is remarkable. It really suggests that this isn't just some arbitrary legal rule we came up with. It feels more like a necessary condition for a society to even call itself just.
Our deep dive today is into the jurisprudence of innocence, safeguards against doubt. And we've got some really fascinating source material to work with, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. It covers everything from, old philosophical ratios that guide our thinking to big global treaties like the ICCPR, and even dives into historical religious law and how a modern nation like Pakistan puts it all together.
So our mission today, really, is to connect those dots. We want to understand not just what the presumption of innocence is, but why.
Yes. Why is it the bedrock?
Why is it the bedrock? What's the shared logic that makes every system, at its best, prioritize avoiding a wrongful conviction above all else?
It sounds like we're charting a course from a really abstract, high-level moral idea all the way down to the nitty-gritty of what happens on a courtroom floor.
That's the plan.
So let's jump in. Let's start with that guiding philosophy. Okay, let's unpack this. The sources kick us off with this concept that really defines the whole moral calculus of the system. It's that classic maxim, better to free 10 guilty than punish 1 innocent.
Right, the Blackstone ratio. And it's so much more than just a catchy phrase. It is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, the moral compass for the entire criminal justice system.
It's a statement of priorities.
It's an explicit ethical choice. The system is saying, up front, we choose reliability over efficiency.
And that's a huge trade-off. I mean, think about it. If your only goal was to lock up every single criminal...
Maximum safety, maximum retribution.
Yeah, then the idea of intentionally letting 10 guilty people walk free would be insane. It's a complete failure from that perspective.
Of course. But this ratio tells us that's not the primary goal. It's an acknowledged, baked-in acceptance that society has to absorb the risk of the 10 guilty getting away with it.
All to prevent the one catastrophe.
The one single, irreversible catastrophe of punishing an innocent person. And that word, catastrophe, is key. It's not just an error. It's a systemic betrayal.
It's interesting because in civil law, like in a lawsuit over money, the standard is just a preponderance of the evidence.
Right, 51%. Tip the scales just slightly and you win.
But the second the state wants to take your freedom, that standard skyrockets. It becomes beyond a reasonable doubt.
And that phrase is doing so much work. It's effectively the system declaring its tolerance for error. It's saying you would rather fail to convict 99 guilty people than succeed in convicting 1 innocent person.
Let's talk about that for a second, the inefficiency of it all, because building a system like this is deliberately slow. It's expensive.
Oh, absolutely.
You need more resources, more investigations, more appeals, more everything. It's like building friction into the machine on purpose.
That's exactly what it is. The friction is the safeguard. We accept the inefficiency, the cost, the slowness, because the moral price of getting it wrong, of that 1 innocent conviction, is viewed as infinite. It's incalculable.
So if you were to kind of quantify the cost of different errors...
A false acquittal, letting a guilty person go, that's a bad outcome. Yeah. Very bad outcome. Society is harmed. But a false conviction, that's exponentially worse. It's a different category of failure altogether.
So the 10.1 ratio is just the system declaring its optimization strategy?
Precisely. It's saying we're optimizing to minimize the cost of error, not to maximize the number of convictions. And that's a profound choice for a state to make.
And that number, 10, You mentioned earlier it's not literal.
No, not at all. It's hyperbole. It's a rhetorical device meant to shock the system, to drill this mindset into every prosecutor, every judge, every
It's
juror.
a constant reminder.
It's a constant reminder that says, if you're faced with a choice between an error of inaction, which is an acquittal, and an error of action, a conviction,
You have to choose inaction.
you must choose inaction every single time.
Because the state's error is, what, uniquely damaging. Is that the idea?
It's uniquely destructive. A crime committed by one person against another is a terrible private wrong. But a wrong committed by the court, by the state itself, against a citizen it's supposed to protect.
That's a betrayal of the whole deal.
It's a betrayal of the social contract. It's an act of institutional injustice, and that rots the system from the inside out.
Okay, but let me push back a little here because this is where it gets tricky. If the system is too good at protecting the innocent, if that ratio in practice becomes more like 100 to 1, doesn't that create a different problem? Doesn't it risk, emboldening criminals who know the bar for conviction is almost impossibly high?
And that is the perpetual tightrope walk of criminal law. That's the tension at its very heart.
So where's the line? How does the system balance necessary caution with anarchy?
The line is defined by that one word, reasonable.
Right.
Reasonable doubt. The system acknowledges that absolute 100% mathematical certainty is impossible in human affairs. We can't prove guilt like a physics equation, so it settles for the highest level of certainty that is humanly attainable.
And all the rules of evidence, of procedure, they're all just tests.
They're all stress tests against that standard. And if the prosecution's case can't clear that bar, even if we all have a strong hunch the person is guilty, the system commands us to treat them as innocent. That's the boundary.
So, as a society, we're essentially making a pact. We agree to live with the consequences of some guilty people going free.
Which is a real cost.
A very real cost. But we accept that cost because the alternative, a system that might condemn even one innocent person, is a moral failure that undermines the entire project.
You've nailed it. The integrity of the process becomes more important than the outcome of any single case.
And that brings us to this idea of the weight of irreversible error. The damage isn't just to the one person who is wrongfully convicted.
Not at all. That's just the beginning. The real systemic cost is the shattering of public trust.
Right.
When you, the public, start to believe that the system is a coin toss, that it can make catastrophic, life-destroying mistakes, you lose faith in everything. The police, the courts, the law itself.
And that cynicism is a much deeper, longer-lasting wound to society. If a guilty person goes free, people are angry, but they still believe in the rules of the game.
But if an innocent person is convicted, the system itself becomes the criminal. The referee is corrupt. And the entire judicial edifice starts to look weak and illegitimate.
So, to sum up this part, the whole philosophical underpinning is that the system must be designed to fail safe.
Fail safe,
Yeah.
exactly. Doubt isn't just an inconvenience for the prosecution. It's treated as the legal equivalent of innocence. The moment a reasonable doubt appears, the state's power to punish has to be withdrawn.
And that realization that this kind of restraint is the top priority is what had to be taken from the realm of philosophy and written down into hard law.
Absolutely. Which is the perfect transition. If the 10.1 ratio is the moral bedrock, how do you make it legally binding on every country? You turn it into international law.
And here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. We're moving from these, abstract philosophical ideas into concrete, legally binding text.
Yes.
The sources point us directly to Article 14 of the ICCPR.
The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it's important to stress what that is. This isn't just a friendly declaration of principles, it's a multilateral treaty.
Meaning if you sign and ratify it, you are legally bound by it.
It becomes part of your domestic legal order. It sets a gold standard for how a state has to treat its people, especially when it's accusing them of a crime.
So Article 14 is the big one for fair trial rights. But there's a specific bit we're focused on here. Can you break down how it actually enshrines this right to be presumed innocent?
Of course. It's Article 14, Paragraph 2. It's a deceptively simple sentence. It just says that everyone charged with a criminal offense shall have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty according to law.
Seems straightforward enough.
But the real power is in what that one sentence implies. The UN Human Rights Committee, which interprets the treaty, has made it clear that this presumption isn't just a mood or an attitude. It requires a whole suite of other concrete rights to make it real.
What kind of rights?
Well, for example, Article 14.3b says you must have adequate time and facilities to prepare your defense.
Okay, that makes sense.
And 14.3b says you have the right to examine the witnesses against you.
To cross-examine them.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, 14.3g says you cannot be compelled to testify against yourself or to confess guilt.
The right to remain silent.
The right to remain silent. All of these are not separate ideas. They are the necessary machinery to make the presumption of innocence a reality. They're the tools that ensure the state has to do all the work.
That's a brilliant point. The system doesn't just say you're innocent. It actively creates procedures that make it incredibly difficult for the state to prove guilt unfairly. It's an attempt to level the playing field.
It completely flips the historical power dynamic. For centuries, in many systems, if you were accused, the onus was on you to somehow prove your innocence, to clear your name. The ICCPR says, no. The state is the one making the accusation. The state has all the resources, so the state is the only active party that has to prove anything. The accused can, in theory, remain completely passive and win if the prosecution's case is weak.
So, when a country signs on to this, what does it mean for how they have to run their judicial machinery day to day?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it dictates the operational mechanics of the entire system. It means the burden of proof is 100% on the prosecution, always. But it goes beyond the courtroom.
How so?
It means public officials, the police, the government, are forbidden from making public statements that declare someone as guilty before a trial. The perp walk for the media, for instance, is highly questionable under Article 14.
Because it creates a presumption of guilt in the public mind.
Precisely. It also means that pretrial detention, locking someone up before they're convicted, must be the rare exception, not the rule. The default position must always be liberty. The entire atmosphere of the system must reflect the principle.
You know, there's a Latin phrase for this, isn't there? The sources mention it.
Yes. In dubio pro reo.
When in doubt, for the accused.
It's the perfect legal distillation of the Blackstone ratio. It's the operational command to every judge. Any legal uncertainty, any doubt in the evidence, must be resolved in favor of the individual, not the state.
And it seems like this isn't just something countries sign and forget about. There's an enforcement mechanism of a sort.
There is. The UN Human Rights Committee constantly scrutinizes how states are complying. They review reports, they issue what are called general comments that interpret the articles, and they make it very clear when a country's laws or practices are falling short. They've pushed states on everything from how evidence is treated on appeal to the rules for sentencing.
So it's a living document.
It's a living document that tries to make sure this commitment is deep and systemic, not just a nice-sounding phrase in a constitution.
The very existence of the ICCPR and the fact that so many nations have ratified it really speaks to a global consensus. This isn't a Western idea or an Eastern idea. It's a human idea.
It's a recognition that protecting human dignity requires this specific safeguard. The ICCPR is essentially the legal architecture that the global community built to enforce that philosophical promise we started with. Better to free 10 guilty.
It institutionalizes that moral restraint.
It does. It provides a safety net. If a country's own laws fail, this international obligation gives lawyers and activists a tool to hold their government accountable to a minimum standard of justice.
So that's the modern formal global structure. But what's so fascinating in the research Mr. Muir compiled is that this idea is much older. It's not like the UN invented it in 1966.
Not even close.
If we peel back the layers of history and look at a completely different legal tradition, we see the same mechanism, the same idea of using doubt as a shield at work centuries earlier.
We do. And that historical depth is what makes the argument for its universality so compelling.
So we're shifting gears from the modern international framework to a much older, specific legal tradition. The sources highlight a really powerful parallel in Islamic jurisprudence, specifically the idea that the application of Hudood punishments is blocked by doubt.
Yes, or shubihite. And this comparison is so important because it proves that using doubt as an absolute legal barrier is not some unique product of the European Enlightenment or common law.
It's a shared wisdom.
It's a shared wisdom that comes from a deep understanding of human fallibility, especially when the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so let's start with a clear definition for everyone listening. What exactly are Hudood?
Hudood, the singular, is had, refers to a specific category of crimes in Islamic law for which the punishments are fixed and mandatory. They're prescribed directly in the religious texts.
And these are the most serious offenses.
Yes, things like theft, unlawful sexual intercourse, and highway robbery. And the punishments are often very severe corporal or even capital punishment. They're considered offenses against God's law, which is why the penalty is fixed, and a judge has no discretion to change it once guilt has been proven.
And that's the key, isn't it, once guilt has been proven? Because the severity of the punishment logically demands an equally extreme standard of proof.
Exactly. This is where the principle of shubuhat, or doubt, comes in as a mandatory override. There's a foundational legal maxim here. Ijra al-Hudood by al-Shubuhat.
Which means?
Avert the Hudood by doubts. It's the system's primary structural safeguard. Because the Hyde penalty is so severe and irreversible, the standard of proof required is set at a level that is, by design, almost impossible to meet.
Let's get into the weeds on that. How does shubuhat actually work? What counts as a doubt that's strong enough to block a Hyde punishment?
The evidentiary standards are extraordinary. For an offense like zina, or unlawful intercourse, classical jurisprudence requires 4 adult, male, pious eyewitnesses who all saw the act of penetration itself.
Wow.
Yeah. Or, alternatively, a confession that is given freely without any coercion and repeated multiple times on separate occasions. Shubuhat is any doubt, any ambiguity that prevents that perfect standard from being met.
So if you have 3 witnesses instead of 4, that's shubuhat.
Absolutely. If one witness's story has a minor contradiction with another's, that's shubuhat. If there's any ambiguity about the intent of the accused or a procedural error in how the case was brought,
It all qualifies as doubt.
it all qualifies. The system is actively designed to search for a reason, not to apply the fixed Hyde penalty. It functions as the ultimate cautionary mechanism, forcing the judge to stop unless the evidence is absolutely, undeniably incontrovertible.
That is a remarkable failsafe. So what happens then if a doubt is found and the Hyde is blocked? Does the accused just walk free? Because, they might still have committed a crime.
And that's the most sophisticated part of the structure. No, they don't necessarily just walk free.
Okay.
If the evidence is not strong enough for the extreme Hyde standard, the case doesn't just disappear. It can be recategorized and dealt with under a different type of penalty called tazir.
And what's that?
Tazir refers to discretionary punishments. Here, the judge has the flexibility to decide on a penalty that fits the specific crime and its circumstances. It's not fixed by scripture, so it could be anything from a warning to a fine to a prison sentence.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that would work?
Sure. Let's say someone is accused of theft, which has a Hyde punishment. The evidence is strong, but maybe there's some doubt, some shubuhat, about whether the item stolen was properly secured, which is a condition for the Hyde.
Okay.
That doubt would block the severe, fixed Hyde penalty.
Yeah.
But the judge, under the tazir system, could still sentence the person to, say, a year in prison for the act of theft.
I see. So the system accomplishes 2 things at once.
Exactly. First, it protects the individual from an extreme, irreversible punishment based on fallible human evidence.
And second?
And second, it still maintains public order by ensuring that a crime doesn't go completely unpunished. The shubuhat mechanism is a shield for liberty, not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
This historical structure is just.
Mhm.
It's echoing the same wisdom we saw everywhere else, the 10.1 ratio, the ICCPR. It's all about prioritizing certainty when the consequences are severe.
It's a fascinating structural comparison. You have the modern secular world defining certainty as beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
And you have classical Islamic jurists, centuries earlier, using shubuhat to block a Hyde. The language is different, the context is different, but the function is identical.
Erecting an absolute legal barrier against the state's most awesome power.
When human evidence is inevitably imperfect, it's just powerful, compelling evidence that this concern, this need for a safeguard against doubt, is a universal and timeless feature of sophisticated legal thought.
Okay, so let's bring all these concepts down to earth. We've looked at the philosophy, the global legal standard, and the deep historical roots. But how does a modern country take all these different threads and weave them together into a functioning legal system?
It's a great question.
The sources, as we've mentioned, focus on Pakistan's criminal jurisprudence as a case study. And it's a perfect one because its system has to synthesize all these elements.
It really is a crucible for these ideas. Pakistan is a signatory to the ICCPR, so it's bound by Article 14. It inherited its basic framework from the British common law tradition.
Which includes the presumption of innocence and proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly, and as an Islamic republic, its constitution also requires its laws to be in conformity with Islamic principles, which brings in the powerful historical concept of shubuhat.
So how does this actually work in a Pakistani courtroom on a Tuesday morning? How is the presumption of innocence operationalized?
It means that the entire legal architecture, things like the Criminal Procedure Code and the Law of Evidence, the Kanuni Shahanat, they're all structured to place the entire burden on the state. The accused literally starts at zero. They don't have to say a word or present a single piece of evidence until the prosecution has, step by step, proven every single element of the alleged crime.
And it's not enough for the law to just be on the books. The judges have to actively enforce it.
That's where jurisprudence, the body of case law built up over decades, becomes so critical. The Supreme Court of Pakistan and the high courts are constantly issuing rulings that give practical meaning to phrases like benefit of the doubt.
Can you give us an example, a specific principle from Pakistani case law that shows this in action?
Absolutely. A classic one that comes up all the time is about circumstantial evidence. Let's say there's no smoking gun, no eyewitness. The prosecution's case is built on a chain of circumstances. Pakistani jurisprudence is incredibly strict on this. It demands that the chain of evidence must be so complete, so ironclad, that it excludes every other reasonable possibility except the guilt of the accused.
So if there's another plausible explanation for the circumstances,
Even one.
then the benefit of the doubt must go to the accused?
It must go to the accused. The court has to choose the interpretation that favors innocence. That's a direct, practical application of the 10.1 ratio and the principle of shubuhat playing out in a modern courtroom.
It really is a convergence. The common law calls it benefit of doubt. The historical principle calls it shubuhat, but the function is identical.
The mechanism is universal. The system would rather risk a mistaken acquittal than a mistaken conviction. Another example is how the courts treat the testimony of an accomplice.
Someone who was also involved in the crime.
Right. The jurisprudence says that this kind of testimony is inherently suspect. You have to treat it with extreme caution because the person has a clear motive to lie to save themselves.
So you can't convict someone just based on what their alleged accomplice says.
Not without what's called material corroboration. There must be some other independent piece of evidence that connects the accused to the crime. If that corroboration is missing, it creates doubt, and again, that doubt must benefit the accused. It's another one of those procedural friction points we talked about.
It's designed to make the prosecution's job hard.
It's designed to minimize institutional error.
Now, when you have all these different traditions coming together, common law, international treaties, religious jurisprudence, does that create conflict, or do they tend to reinforce each other on this specific point?
It can create complexities in other areas of law, certainly, but on the presumption of innocence, they are overwhelmingly reinforcing. The core message from every tradition is restraint.
So the historical weight of shubuhat almost gives a cultural anchor to the modern common law standard.
That's a perfect way to describe it. It provides this deep local legitimacy to what is also a global concept. A judge in Pakistan isn't just applying a rule inherited from the British. They're also channeling a legal and ethical principle with deep roots in their own history and culture.
So the Pakistani system really is this synthesis point where the philosophy, the global standard, and the historical safeguards all meet.
They meet and are tested every single day. When a judge throws out a weak case, they are performing the same fundamental act as an ancient jurist blocking a had punishment. They are asserting that the risk of systemic error is greater than the benefit of a potential conviction.
It all comes back to the state restraining itself.
And proving that its legitimacy comes not from the power to punish, but from the wisdom to know when not to.
But, all these safeguards we've been discussing, they're designed around human fallibility.
Yeah.
A lying witness, a mistaken memory, a flawed investigation.
Yes, they're human-centric safeguards.
But the world is changing. What happens when the key evidence isn't a person, but a piece of code?
Now you're getting to the frontier of this entire field. The rise of digital evidence, AI analysis, facial recognition. It introduces a whole new kind of doubt.
A technological doubt.
A technological doubt. The question is no longer just, is the witness telling the truth? It's, is the algorithm that identified the suspect biased? Or can we even audit the black box AI that processed the data?
The doubt isn't about human memory, it's about hidden errors in the code.
Precisely. And that requires our jurisprudence of innocence to evolve. The courts can't just be experts on human nature anymore. They have to become experts on the fallibility of technology, too.
It means the burden on the state just got even heavier. They don't just have to present the digital evidence, they have to prove its integrity.
We'll have to prove the integrity of the tool that produced it. The commitment to certainty remains the same, but the challenges are brand new.
Wow, what a journey. We started with this really simple, almost brutal moral math.
The 10.1 ratio. The idea that a systemic mistake is fundamentally worse than a misconviction.
From there, we saw how that philosophy got written down, formalized into global human rights law.
In ICCPR Article 14, making the presumption of innocence a binding promise between states and their citizens.
Then we jumped back in time and saw this incredible parallel in Islamic jurisprudence with the concept of shubuhat, of doubt acting as an absolute firebreak against the state's most severe punishments.
A two-tiered system designed to protect liberty while still maintaining order.
And finally, we saw how all of those threads, the philosophical, the global, the historical, get woven together and put into practice every day in a modern legal system like Pakistan's.
Where principles like the benefit of doubt are the living embodiment of that ancient cross-cultural wisdom.
The big takeaway for me from all this research by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir is that the real focus across all these systems isn't on achieving perfect punishment. They know that's impossible.
The focus is on a perfect process.
A perfect process. A process designed from top to bottom with one primary goal: to guard against the single greatest failure a justice system can commit, which is to punish an innocent person.
And that entire architecture, everything we've talked about, it all rests on one thing: the willingness of the state to restrain itself, to accept limits on its own power as the price of justice.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to take away from this.
If the doubt of the past was about a shaky witness or a contaminated crime scene, and the doubt of the present is about procedural errors or violations of rights, what is the doubt of the future?
The algorithmic doubt we just touched on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Does technology, does AI make proving innocence easier? Or does it just introduce a new, more dangerous kind of systemic error? Bias that's hidden deep inside the training data of an algorithm, or a decision made by a black box AI that no human can even explain.
And if that's the case, will we need even stronger, even more robust human safeguards to protect us from the certainty of machines?
That's the question. When the evidence comes from a code we can't see and can't question, how do we find the modern shubuhat? How do we find the reasonable doubt?
A profound question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it gives you a lot to think about the price of certainty and the constant, vigilant work it takes to build a just world. Until next time.